$103 per barrel. That is the price the world is paying right now for a war that almost no one saw coming in its current form. As of this Sunday, March 16, 2026, the United States and Israel have been bombing Iran for more than 2 weeks straight. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed to Western shipping, and neither side shows any intention of stopping. Iran's foreign minister warns that if other countries intervene, the war will widen. The American president says he might bomb Iran's main oil export terminal again, quote, just for fun. And somewhere in Tehran, a new supreme leader whom Washington claims may not even be alive has pledged to keep the world's most important energy choke points shut. This is no longer a contained military operation. This is a conflict reshaping the global order in real time, and understanding what is happening and what comes next has never been more urgent. On Sunday, March 15th, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi delivered a pointed warning to countries around the world. Speaking to the Arabic language outlet Al-Arabi Al-Jadid, Araghchi said that the war would not end until Tehran receives guarantees that it will never be attacked again and that reparations will be paid. He also urged other nations to refrain from any action that could lead to escalation, while claiming that Iran has evidence that American bases in the Middle East, specifically in the United Arab Emirates, were used to launch strikes against Iranian territory. On the other side, President Donald Trump told NBC News that Iran wants to negotiate, but that he is unwilling to come to the table because the terms are not good enough yet. He went further, saying he could strike the island of Kharg, from which almost all of Iran's crude oil exports flow, just for fun. Trump also announced that American forces would intensify attacks along Iran's coastline north of the Strait of Hormuz to clear a path for oil tankers to resume transit. Meanwhile, the Israeli military announced a new wave of strikes against targets in western Iran, after Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps vowed to hunt down and kill Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Iran's military responded with drone attacks against an Israeli police installation and a satellite communications center. The Pentagon confirmed that more than 15,000 targets have been struck in Iran since the war began on February 28. Despite more than 16 days of sustained bombardment, neither side has softened its rhetoric. According to figures from Iran's Ministry of Health, which have not been independently verified, more than 1,200 people have died. The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, estimates that as many as 3.2 million people have been displaced within Iran, most of them fleeing Tehran and other major urban centers toward the north of the country. To understand how the Middle East arrived at this point, one must look back to a chain of escalations that stretches across years but accelerated dramatically in the last 12 months. The roots of the current war lie in the collapse of the 2015 nuclear agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, from which the United States withdrew in 2018 under Trump's first administration. That withdrawal set off a cycle of Iranian nuclear advancement and American economic pressure that never fully resolved. By mid-2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that Iran had accumulated enough uranium enriched to 60% purity to produce 9 nuclear warheads, according to the agency's own assessment. In June 2025, Israel launched what became known as the 12-Day War, a massive unilateral air campaign targeting Iranian nuclear facilities, military installations, and senior military leaders. The United States joined on June 22, striking the nuclear complexes at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. Iran retaliated with hundreds of ballistic missiles against Israeli cities and even launched an attack on the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, hosting American forces. A ceasefire was brokered on June 24. At least 610 Iranians were killed, along with 28 Israelis, but the ceasefire left every underlying issue unresolved. Iran's nuclear program was damaged but not destroyed. Its missile capability was degraded but not eliminated, and the political humiliation of the 12-Day War radicalized Iranian domestic politics, sparking protests over economic collapse as the rial plummeted against the dollar in late 2025. In early 2026, Oman mediated indirect nuclear negotiations between Washington and Tehran in Geneva. By late February, Oman's foreign minister announced what appeared to be a breakthrough. Iran had agreed to degrade its enriched uranium stockpiles to the lowest possible levels and accept full IAEA verification. Peace seemed within reach. Talks were set to resume on March 2nd. They never did. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive joint military operation against Iran, including a strike that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, his daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchild. The so-called decapitation strike shattered whatever diplomatic pathway remained and plunged the region into open-ended war. The current conflict involves a complex web of actors, each with distinct and often competing interests. The United States, under President Trump, has framed the operation as the elimination of the Iranian regime's capacity to threaten regional stability. The Pentagon has described its campaign as targeting Iran's power projection capabilities, according to Central Command statements. But beneath the military language, Washington's objectives appear to have shifted since the war began. What started as a strike against nuclear and military infrastructure has expanded into what some analysts describe as a campaign of regime degradation. Trump himself has questioned whether Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader elected on March 8 by Iran's Assembly of Experts, is even alive, suggesting that the ultimate goal may extend beyond disarmament. Israel, under Prime Minister Netanyahu, shares the objective of dismantling Iran's nuclear program and has pursued its own parallel strikes on Iranian military assets and infrastructure. Israel's operations have expanded into Lebanon as well, where the Israeli military has clashed with Hezbollah forces in the south, with airstrikes killing civilians including children, according to Lebanese emergency services. Iran, now under the untested leadership of Mojtaba Khamenei, faces an existential strategic dilemma. Its conventional military has been severely degraded, with Trump claiming the country has lost its navy, air force, and radar capabilities. But Iran retains asymmetric tools, drones, mines, short-range missiles, and the capacity to disrupt shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran has framed its blockade as a strategic lever, keeping the strait closed to Western allied vessels, while allowing some passage for ships from countries like China, India, and Turkey, according to reports from vessel tracking services and Iranian officials. The Gulf states find themselves in an unenviable position. Bahrain and Saudi Arabia have reported intercepting Iranian projectiles. Dubai has activated air defenses. These countries are not parties to the war but are absorbing its fallout, both militarily and economically. Their oil exports, which normally flow through the Strait of Hormuz, have been severely disrupted. China presents perhaps the most strategically complex position. Beijing has condemned the killing of Khamenei as a grave violation of Iranian sovereignty and called for an immediate halt to military operations. China is the largest importer of Iranian oil and receives roughly a third of its total oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. It has dispatched naval vessels to the area, and its ships have participated in joint exercises with Russian and Iranian forces in the strait under what has been called the Maritime Security Belt 2026. Russia, for its part, has provided Iran with intelligence that can help Tehran strike American military assets, according to Associated Press sources. Moscow has framed its support as part of a broader effort to build what Kremlin aide Nikolai Patrushev described as a multipolar world order on the oceans. The economic consequences of this war are being felt on every continent, driven above all by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. In normal times, approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day transit through the strait, representing roughly 1/5 of global seaborne oil trade. Since the beginning of the conflict, that traffic has dropped to nearly zero for Western allied shipping. The International Energy Agency estimated that the war would cut global oil supply by about 8 million barrels per day in March, according to their assessment published in mid-March. The impact on prices has been immediate and severe. Brent crude, the international benchmark, closed at $103.14 per barrel on Friday, March 14th, after surging to nearly $120 earlier in the week. Before the war began, Brent was trading at approximately $72.48. West Texas Intermediate, the American benchmark, has risen about 41% to nearly $95 per barrel, according to the Energy Information Administration. Goldman Sachs economists raised their 2026 American inflation forecast by 0.8 percentage points to 2.9% and increased their estimated probability of a recession to 25%. Oxford Economics modeled a more extreme scenario. If oil averages $140 per barrel for 2 months, the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, and Japan would enter economic contraction, and global inflation could reach 5.1%. The disruption extends far beyond oil. Roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer trade transits the Strait of Hormuz, and prices for urea at the New Orleans hub have already risen from $475 to $680 per metric ton, according to industry data. If those shipments remain blocked during the North American spring planting season, the effects could ripple into food prices worldwide. India, facing a critical cooking gas shortage, has invoked emergency powers to protect 333 million households that depend on liquefied petroleum gas. The United States and other governments have authorized the release of 400 million barrels of oil from strategic petroleum reserves. But as the International Energy Agency has noted, global consumption averages over 105 million barrels per day, meaning those reserves would cover barely 4 days of total demand. The strategic release may calm nerves temporarily, but it cannot replace the function of a disrupted shipping corridor. Analysts across the political spectrum are increasingly concerned about the absence of a clear endgame for this conflict. Andreas Kharg, a Middle East security expert at King's College London, told Al Jazeera that Trump's call for a multinational naval coalition to escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz appeared to mask the lack of a broader strategy. Kharg argued that there is no quick military solution to reopening the strait, because all Iran needs to do is strike occasionally to keep insurers away from the waterway. Sending warships without a diplomatic agreement, he said, would expose very expensive military vessels to very cheap but potentially effective projectiles. The comparison to the Iraq War has entered the conversation. According to CNBC analysis, the expanding war effort has uncomfortable echoes of the 2003 conflict, where tens of thousands of American troops on the ground were not enough to end the violence and the conflict dragged on for nearly 9 years. No one in power is openly discussing a ground invasion, but the open-ended nature of the air campaign, combined with the absence of diplomatic off-ramps, has drawn the parallel. Rachel Ziemba, a senior adjunct fellow at the Center for a New American Security, pointed to the broader strategic signaling of the conflict, noting to Al Jazeera that pressure on energy infrastructure in the Gulf and Qatar's preemptive pause of liquefied natural gas production demonstrate what is at stake for global energy markets. On the Iranian side, analysts note that Tehran has turned time into a strategic weapon. By maintaining asymmetric pressure through the Hormuz blockade and regional missile attacks, Iran is attempting to deplete Israeli interceptor stockpiles and inflict continuous economic paralysis, according to Al Jazeera analysis. Israel reportedly informed the United States this week that it is running critically low on ballistic missile interceptors, as reported by Semaphore. Jeremy Konyndyk, president of Refugees International, warned that if the conflict evolves into a long-term war, the humanitarian consequences could worsen dramatically, describing the trajectory as one on course for cataclysmic civilian harm, displacement, and humanitarian need. At the same time, David Roche of Quantum Strategy told CNBC that Iran has its own motivations for not allowing the situation to become permanent. Iran needs oil revenues to survive, he argued, predicting that the strait might partially reopen within 2 to 3 weeks as both sides feel the economic strain. The reverberations of this conflict have reached nearly every corner of the global economy and international diplomacy. In Asia, the impact is most acute. China, India, Japan, and South Korea collectively account for nearly 70% of oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, according to the United States Energy Information Administration. Japan, which relies on the strait for about 70% of its oil imports, has begun releasing strategic reserves. India has negotiated directly with Tehran to secure passage for its tankers, with External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar confirming to the Financial Times that 2 Indian-flagged gas carriers passed through the strait on Saturday after bilateral talks. In Europe, the crisis has tightened an already stressed energy market. The continent receives 12 to 14% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar through the strait. A disruption to those flows tightens the global spot LNG market, where Europe became a major buyer after reducing dependence on Russian pipeline gas. European Union gas storage sat at 30% on February 28, compared to 38% a year earlier, according to the Allianz research assessment. The United Kingdom said it is intensively looking at how to help reopen the strait, with Energy Secretary Ed Miliband describing the issue as critically important. France has been working on a possible international escort mission, though it stressed the operation must wait until fighting subsides. Germany has been more skeptical, with Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul telling ARD television that Berlin does not intend to become an active part of the conflict. In the wider Middle East, the war has triggered a humanitarian emergency beyond Iran. In Lebanon, more than 300,000 people have been displaced since Israeli operations expanded there on March 2, according to the Norwegian Refugee Council. Iranian missiles and drones have struck targets across the Gulf states, including Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, spreading the conflict's physical footprint across 9 countries. American gasoline prices have risen by more than 50 cents per gallon since the war began, according to factcheck.org analysis. Despite Trump's assertion that the disruption does not really affect the United States, energy analysts emphasize that global oil pricing means that when something goes wrong anywhere, prices rise everywhere, as Mark Finley of Rice University's Baker Institute noted. Several critical indicators will determine whether this conflict escalates further or finds a path toward de-escalation. First, watch the Strait of Hormuz. The Wall Street Journal reported on Sunday, citing unnamed American officials, that the Trump administration plans to announce as early as this week that multiple countries have agreed to form a coalition to escort commercial ships through the waterway. Whether that coalition materializes and whether it can operate safely amid Iranian threats will be the most immediate test. Second, watch oil prices. If Brent crude surges past $120 and remains there, the economic pressure on both the warring parties and the global economy may force political calculations to shift. A sustained price above $140, as Oxford Economics has modeled, could tip major economies into recession. Third, watch the humanitarian situation inside Iran. With 3.2 million people already displaced and over 1,200 dead according to Iranian government figures, UNHCR has warned that temporary shelter capacity has reached its limit. A cross-border refugee crisis, which has not yet materialized at scale, could change the diplomatic equation, particularly for neighboring Turkey, which already hosts 2.3 million Syrian refugees. Fourth, watch Mojtaba Khamenei. The new supreme leader, elected on March 8, has yet to appear in public. Whether he consolidates power and whether Iran's military command structure remains coherent under sustained bombardment will shape Tehran's capacity to negotiate or escalate. Fifth, Nowruz, the Persian New Year, falls on March 20th. Iran's population will be watching whether normalcy is possible. The reopening of shops in Tehran's Tahrish Bazaar on Sunday offers a tentative signal, but the holiday could also become a flashpoint for public frustration. 16 days into this war, the most dangerous feature of the conflict is not the missiles, the drones, or even the oil prices. It is the absence of an exit. Neither the United States nor Iran has articulated a realistic set of conditions under which hostilities would end. Washington demands what amounts to capitulation from a regime it has decapitated but not defeated. Tehran demands guarantees and reparations from an adversary that shows no willingness to provide either. And the rest of the world, from Tokyo to Berlin to New Delhi, is left absorbing the economic and humanitarian shockwaves of a war it did not choose, over a strait it cannot bypass, with no clear idea of when or how it will end. The question is no longer whether this conflict will have consequences. The consequences are already here. The question now is whether anyone has the political will to stop them from compounding.